Okay, everyone, good morning and welcome to the Barrier Subcommittee. I'm Ed Buttrey. I was asked by Chair Seconder to sit in and to um, chair this meeting for us. So with that, we'll get started. Can we please have a roll call of the members?
Uh, Yes, thank you. Good morning, everybody. We will start with, we know that Representative Seconder and Director Strauss were both unavailable today. Is Senator Harvey on? No. Okay. Senator Noland?
Here.
Senator Zolnikoff? No. Representative Etchart? No. Representative Teal?
Here.
In sitting in for Director Brereton, Dr. Harrington?
Here.
Great. Stacy Anderson. Oh, I just saw her. Tanner Avery.
Here.
Webb Brown.
Here.
Representative Buttrey.
Here.
Jennifer Hensley.
Here.
Troy Jensen.
I'm here.
Tony King. No. Alan Lloyd. Brad Longcake.
Here.
Kristen McCauley.
Here.
Amy Narrison.
Here.
Allison Paul. No. And Jason Small.
Here.
Okay, that is roll, Mr. Chair.
Okay, thank you, Aaron. Do we have any staff that need to be introduced?
Yeah, sorry. I will give an apology right now. I've been under the weather for several days now, and so my brain isn't quite there. But yes, I'm Erin Sullivan, policy analyst, lead staff for the task force. On the call today, we have Quinlan O'Connor, who is our chief legal counsel and your counsel for this subcommittee. Kevin Bragg, who is the licensing bureau chief with the Employment Standards Division at the department. And then Lisa Patzer, who is our technology guru and runs everything so smoothly. I think that is it for staff on the call today.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Sullivan, and thank you everyone for participating today and for the staff members for being here to support the subcommittee. The next item on the agenda is subcommittee considerations. Aaron, do you want to go through this, starting with a review of the April 13th meeting? I think you're muted, Ms. Sullivan.
Thank you. Sorry, it's going to be a struggle today. I apologize. So I put this on the agenda. I'm doing this for all of the subcommittees just to kind of have an open conversation about the full task force meeting that we had a few weeks ago. And this is our first meeting since that. And so just wanted to hear from the group if anything came out of that meeting that you want to add to your work plan or what your thoughts were, if there's any updates to the work plan you want to do moving forward. Just a general conversation, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Sullivan. And just as a review, I did listen to the April meeting once again to remind myself we had pretty robust discussion on definition of good moral character, whether we need to have a requirement for good moral character, and if we do, should we give it some better definition in statute or in rule? We talked about national certifying entities and the need to have licensure, or is there a way that we can consolidate or speed up the process in cases where we have national entities that actually do most of the licensing work and training and education testing, those type of things. We talked about provisional licensure. Ms. Sullivan, we may have put that one to bed based on the changes that we had recently incorporated in statute. We talked about multiple licensure and the need for background checks and or fingerprinting. If somebody's already licensed and found to be in good standing by the state and they apply for a second or third or whatever extra license, do we need to go through that entire process again, or can we speed that up? And then there was some public comment on property management licensure and if that is something that is needed for short-term rental management. And that's what I had as an overview. Do any of the other committee members have anything they want to discuss from the April 13th meeting?
Representative, this is Jen Hensley. I just wanted to clarify for the recap, the property management licensure was an example of a topic that a different legislative interim policy committee was discussing. And so I suggested that we make sure to do a policy sweep of those interim committees to see if there are other areas that may overlap with this committee. It was not specific to property management. It was simply an example of a conversation that's happening out there.
Thank you, Ms. Hensley. Does anyone else have any issue or comment from the April 13th meeting? And Ms. Sullivan, if you see a hand raised and I don't, please let me know. I'm not seeing any additional conversation. So sub-item B on agenda item 2 is review topics, barriers created by licensing requirement, administrative inefficiencies and delays. Do we have any review of follow-up data, Ms. Sullivan?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. So we were able to pull together some information for you based on the requests at the last meeting. And there was, so I have two documents that we can go over. And I did send those out and they're posted online. Lisa's going to help me out and share her screen if the committee wants to. Let's start with the good moral character analysis. Lisa? So this basically the excuse me, the follow-up that was requested for the good moral character requirements is a kind of a historical context. How many last meeting I provided you guys a chart or a table that had all of the statutes that referenced some sort of good moral character requirement. And I believe it was Senator Nolan that was interested in kind of the history of it and if um, just some historical context. And so going through the compiler's comments, which are only available since 1969. And so this is, Lisa, go ahead and scroll down to the very bottom of, or the Appendix A, page 6. That's what I'm talking about. So I was able to just read through the compiler's comments from 1969 onwards. Some of these statutes have been in place a lot longer than that, but it's safe to say that the requirements have been in statutes since at least 1969 for those older statutes. But you can see on this, what I did is I put um, all of the instances for occupations or regulated roles in the entire MCA that have a good moral character requirement. So you can see there's like lobbyists have one in 5-7-103, peace officers in the local government statutes and all of that. I didn't do a historical analysis on that because that's not this committee's concern, but I just wanted you to see that they are. This is a requirement that is kind of peppered throughout the MCA, and there is no definition of it anywhere. But you'll see like physicians since at least 1969, that has been in their statute. Dentists, that statute was enacted in 1935, and so there's probably always been in there. But at least since 1969. And then the only one that I found that was actually amended in is which one? I put it as a footnote. Where did it go? It was accounting, I think, accounting firms. If anybody can find it, help me out. There was just one that was amended in. The statute was enacted, and this is going to drive me crazy if I can't find it. Where's my footnote? Oh, right here, CPA firm owners. So on the very last page, if you see 37-50-330 is for owners of CPA firms. And so that statute was enacted in 2001, but the amendment for a good moral character requirement was put in to statute in 2017. Other than that, they've always been there. And there have been some instances where the requirement has been removed entirely. I can't remember if I talked about this at the last meeting, but last session, the agency put together a bill to remove the good moral character requirement for professional employer organizations. because it didn't really need to be in there. And so that one, at least I know, has been removed in recent past. I'm not sure about others, but that is something that when we're doing the board, the Practice Act reviews, that we kind of take a look at that and see is it actually necessary. The rest of the information that is in this document was, I can't remember who asked for some, maybe what is it like across the states? And so there is no rhyme or reason to it. There's some states that have as few as 8 occupations that have this requirement to as many as 119. This is based on a 2020 study. And but obviously same kind of thing, heavily regulated industries where public protection is important, public safety and their consumer protection, then those are the occupations that tend to have these requirements. And then as far as the um, criteria. There's a couple states, I think we talked about Michigan last time, where they actually define good moral character. It's in their Occupational License for Former Offenders Act, but it is specific to occupational licensing, and it's demonstrating the propensity to serve the public fairly, honestly, and openly. Florida, I think, is the other one that has some requirements that actually listed out. And so, yeah, it says Florida statutes define it as having a history of honesty, fairness, and respect for laws. Denial must be backed by clear and convincing evidence and must show a substantial connection to professional responsibilities. Um, and so I did on page 5, I think it is, there's just kind of a brief comparison of the different, just a handful of the states and kind of their process and application. Um, I did see some recent legislation that came through. Both of these were back in 2023. So in Rhode Island, they removed the standard of good moral character for opticians. I didn't look into like the background of any of these bills. I just did a search. And then in Tennessee, they basically say that this was all, excuse me, also in 2023. They said that a licensing authority can't use vague terms um, without providing an explanation of how prior conviction directly relates to applicable occupation, profession, business, or trade. So it seems like a lot of these are related to the um, criminal history and kind of, for previous offenders, trying to get some help for them to get remove that barrier to get into these occupations. What else? Okay, and then I just put some policy considerations for the group, and you guys can talk about this. And that's on page 5 or 6. I don't know. So these are just some ideas that you could talk about developing into a recommendation. You could define good moral character in statute or rule, and that would reduce subjective interpretation across the boards. You could standardize background check and evaluation procedures for all the professions requiring this review, or recommend to implement some guidance on how criminal history should be weighed, making sure that it's relevant to the duties of the profession, so it's less ambiguous. Consider just eliminating or replacing the moral character language with more specific, eliminate it or replace it with more specific evidence-based standards. You could recommend to develop some training for licensing boards on the evaluation of applicants, including the criteria for rehabilitation, mitigating circumstances, and the like. Or just recommend to have the department review and update the statutes periodically to ensure the requirements align with workforce needs and don't create unnecessary barriers. So, some brainstorming for you all to start your conversation.
Thank you, Ms. Sullivan. Just a couple questions before we get to to the member comments. We had talked about the potential impacts if we remove those requirements or redefine them on compacts or other
Yep.
reciprocity with other state type
Mhm.
licensing. Have we come up with any issues that for specific licenses that might be affected?
No, so this should be kind of a separate conversation from background checks. But there's no language in any of the compacts that require a good moral character requirement. A lot of them just say that they just kind of say that the state has to license it, and then most of them do require background checks. But again, that's a separate thing, a requirement from the good moral character requirement. So I didn't find any language in any of the compacts. I don't know about reciprocity agreements. That would be probably a Kevin or Quinlan question. But to my knowledge, this is um, it's an it's not a requirement that is needed to stay in compacts.
Okay, and then just last quick question.
Mhm.
If we were to decide to direct or ask the department to define good moral character in rural, do you have
Mhm.
all the statutory authority you would need to make that definition without legislature having to act?
Not sure. So I think what we should do for recommendations is maybe have a conversation, and if that is the direction you want to go, then we can work internally before the next meeting to kind of detail out that recommendation, and then identify anything that may need to happen if it's something that we can just yeah, direct the boards to do, great. If it's something that would need a statutory change, then, we can identify that in the draft recommendation. And I think this committee meets one more time before our June meeting, our June, in-person meeting. And so that's great that we could discuss it and kind of, get it ready for the whole task force, at that meeting.
Okay, and if we could just ask that we could put that sheet back up online that shows the policy considerations, that page 5 or 6 or whatever it is, so that the members can see that as we talk. We'll now go to member questions dealing with good moral character. Senator Noland.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I don't know if it needs to be as simple as this, or it could be. So what I have is a good moral character refers to a personal history of honesty, fairness, and respect for the rights of others and for state and federal law. I don't know if that covers enough, but that's when we were all talking, that was one of the things that I thought, hey, let's just explain it. This is pretty simple. If we need to go into it even further, we could list our A, B's, C's, and D's. Like I think it was Tennessee's that Aaron got ready for us, and there was another one. Like there is a substantial connection between the lack of good moral character of the individual and the professional responsibilities of a registered contractor. Then we could say the finding by the board of a lack of moral character is supported by clear and convincing evidence. So there's a lot of stuff that we could do, but I was wondering if it could be as simple as that, unless we need to get deeper. Again, my comment was good moral character refers to a personal history of honesty, fairness, and respect for the rights of others and for state and federal law. Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Noland. As Senator Noland, one of the things that concerns me is that if we define it, that we put in that definition things that are tangible and measurable. And I think that, when you're talking about following federal or state law, that's kind of easy. If you haven't been convicted of violating the laws, that's pretty easy. But I wonder about things like honesty, fairness, respect, those type of things. How do we quantify that? It seems to be sort of subjective. Do you think a person's honest and fair? Are they not? How would you prove that they are or aren't? I'd be interested in your thoughts on that, Senator.
You bet. Well, the honesty one is, we have in our particular a government, we have ethics boards where we bring up things somebody didn't conduct themselves in basically what I just said, because I took some of that from there. You got to be honest. And if we don't think they are, or the board, because I'd like to leave it to the board. I don't know that we have to, but we just needed to give them some guidelines. Honesty, they haven't misrepresented, and you have to prove that. I agree. I know that. But I think from what I'm hearing, they'd like some direction. This is this is a fairly easy way to say it. Honesty. What's fairness? I guess I don't know if we have to define fairness. So I agree, maybe we have to keep going, but respect for the rights of others, that's a pretty, in my mind, you don't try to abuse somebody, you're respecting them. Um, you know, I, I don't know if I want to go down the dental area or uh, mortician things, respect the rights of others, because we've had things have all come up under those two particulars. So what is respect? Well, do we have to define that? I don't know that we do. I just thought if we could get something generic, Mr. Chair, if you think that's, and I don't want to say too ambiguous, but if it's too maybe it's not strong enough, I don't know. But that was what I was thinking, Mr. Chair.
Okay, thank you, Senator Nolan. I think that's really good input. Appreciate that. Let's go to Ms. McCauley, please.
Hi, good morning. Um, Thank you, Mr. Chair. In the last conversation that I remember us having regarding good moral character is that generally maybe we just want to remove that as a qualifying requirement anyway, which would negate any need to define it, particularly since it's not part of the compact obligations. And there's already a stringent list of things that need to be done in the process of licensure. A background check largely screens for problematic behavior and already rules out overt moral misconduct. And then in today's social network online presence, if you do something wrong, it's all over Facebook, it's over Yelp. The market will bear that out. And I think just this requirement for good moral character is a barrier in and of itself, not because it's excluding people of poor moral character, but because there's a large group of individuals that just generally don't see themselves as worthy, but are more than capable and excellent contractors and employees or workers, and would be more than apt at that skill set, but maybe don't have the personal confidence or the historical personal value that would allow them to comfortably seek out a good moral character statement. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Ms. McCauley. Let's now go to Ms. Narrison.
Um, Thank you. Kristen sort of stole a lot of what I was going to say. So I checked in with the psychiatrist and they, this isn't like a top priority for them. They don't see this as being a huge barrier for applicants, but they would be in favor of removing the requirement, at least for psychiatrists. They can't speak for all licensees. So their position would be, as long as it doesn't interfere with any reciprocity agreements, eliminate that requirement. Their position is it's vague. It can also be abused. Are people getting their recommendations or their letters of good moral character? Are they being authenticated? So they don't really see it as adding value to the process. Potentially, it could be harmful to the process. And so they would be in favor of just removing that requirement.
Thank you, Ms. Narrison. We'll go to Dr. Harrington.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, just a couple of comments. I met with our legal group just to ask them their perspective on this, and they referred me to Black's Law Dictionary, which says the definition is a pattern of behavior consistent with the community's current ethical standards, showing an absence of deceit or morally reprehensible conduct. It's very similar to what Mr. Nolan was referring to in a more elegant way. But the comment I wanted to make was that they pointed out that it's in virtually all federal regulations, and I do a lot of credentialing for psychiatrists, psychologists, medical providers, nurses. I can't remember a single instance where this has been invoked to deny a license, which kind of supports the do we really need it sort of concept, because it's pretty well covered by background checks now, because the morally reprehensible behavior will surface in a background check. So that's just my comment. Okay. Thank you,
Yes,
Chair.
thank you, Dr. Harrington. Are there any other comments from subcommittee members? Mr. Avery.
Yeah, I just wanted to second that, or third or fourth that at this point, that I think that if there might not be a reason to have that, especially if it's going to be really hard to enforce. So just wanted to chime in.
Thank you, Mr. Avery. Let's go to Senator Zolnikoff, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to chime in since everybody else did. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Dr. Harrington, do you have another comment? Your hand is still raised.
No, it won't go down. Sorry about that.
Okay. No problem. So I'm not seeing any other hands raised. We've had a couple folks speak in favor of removing the requirement for good moral character in the statutes pretty much across the board for any licensure that would reference it. We have other comments that say we should adapt a definition, whether through statute or rule. Are there any other preferences by members? Ms. Sullivan.
Yes, sorry. I just remembered that there was one thing that I was supposed to add to this, and Dr. Harrington's comments about the federal requirements kind of reminded me. So, if the committee does want to move forward with just a blanket removal, there might be, I know of at least one that is the real estate appraisers actually have in the federal law that our board has to adhere to a good moral character requirement. And so if we develop that recommendation, I would look to I do a little bit deeper dive into each of these just to make sure that if it's required federally, and we get audited every year for that board and that program, that we would keep that in there. But then the other ones, if there were no restrictions, then you could recommend to remove. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Sullivan. Last chance for any comments. I would like to get this one put to bed if we can and give some recommendation to staff. Let's go to Mr. Jensen, please.
So the question that I have is I don't believe that all boards do a background check. It appears to me from listening to folks on here that it looks like a lot of the medical boards do a background check per statute, but I don't believe that all boards are required to do a background check. I think a lot of the boards do more of a letter of recommendation. And so if you take away the background check and think of a board that just sees an application and doesn't do any background check, I'm curious if you took away good moral character, would that then take away letters of recommendation? So now you don't know if an applicant has good moral character at all. And so I'm just curious what the effect of this would be on all boards if this was to be recommended across everything. So those are kind of my questions on what kind of a repercussion would this have?
Thank you, Mr. Jensen. Mr. Bragg, did you have something regarding that comment?
Apologies. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Not specifically to that comment. I'm happy to have the rest of the task force members comment. I just wanted to clarify a couple of things about questions that we asked on application to all the licensees.
Yeah, please go ahead, Mr. Bragg.
Thank you, Chair Buttry, members of the task force. It's great to see everybody. Apologies for talking again. But did want to make sure and clarify that we do ask personal history questions inside of every single licensing application. Specifically for healthcare licensees, there are some additional questions, probably 5 or 6. But inside of those 14-ish to 20-ish questions, and I'm happy to provide the committee with copies of those questions, We do ask about prior licensure, whether or not credentials have been surrendered, whether or not there's been prior discipline, whether or not there's been suspension or withdrawal of a license in lieu of a suspension or other type of discipline. And then we ask specific questions about substance use inside of most of our healthcare applications. And then there's some additional personal history questions that we answer. And one of the things that was brought up earlier was we talked about professional employer, or Aaron mentioned the professional employer organizations and why we removed that background check requirement specifically. Part of that was we had never denied a license for somebody to have a background check for PEOs, which is the acronym for that group. And so we weren't finding value in that. For good moral character, it certainly can be something that board members and the department can look at. One of the things that I worry about is defining it and leaving it to each individual board. And I'm not asking for it to be the department. Let me clarify that. Letting that be that way creates the same thing that we have collectively fought against, which is standardizing licensing to make it so much quicker and efficient. And I appreciate all the comments about that we've had in the past. But I do want to make sure that it's something, if it is, that's the path that the task force chooses to go down, that it's clear, and that it's also easily applied, because the vast majority of applications, as you know now, are processed by staff. They're not processed by each individual board. And so removing the good moral character language doesn't mean that we will remove those personal history questions inside of each of the applications that people are already submitting information to. So I just wanted to make that clarification, and I appreciate the opportunity, Chair Buttry.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Bragg. So, Mr. Bragg, are you saying that if you do a background check, you're in essence getting those references? But what happens if there is not a background check requirement? Would you still be checking for those things that you just discussed?
It's a great question, Chair Buttry. Again, Kevin Bragg for the record. I think we probably all know somebody who maybe is not the best of moral character, that may not have been arrested at some point in their life. And so I don't know that that covers it necessarily either, with a background check. We do certainly still inquire into licensees or applicants' history and do individual searches about their background, even if there's not a background check requirement. And again, the vast majority of those applications processed by our staff, they're being issued because folks are not having these issues that we're contemplating when we think about the worst case scenario with good moral character. And I hope that answers the question, Chair Buttry.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Bragg. Let's go to Mr. Brown, please.
Hi there. Webb Brown, Montana Dental Association. Thank you, Chair Buttry. We're confirming with our Government Affairs Committee on Tuesday, but you know my personal position. I think we get rid of it. You can't legislate morality, and I don't know how you can insert it into the licensing as well. So I'm certainly in favor of just getting rid of it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Brown. Ms. Hensley.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I think that this sounds like a conversation I want to have with this group off the record over a bottle of wine in college and with a philosophy professor present, right? Because these are the sorts of questions that are fun to grapple with, like on one hand and on the other hand. And so, of course, that's why clarification is needed in code, because there exists that gray area. And so when something so obvious pops to my head as, yeah, it's such a gray area, it's so subjective, let's definitely get rid of it, we can't legislate morality, I'm forced to ask myself, does it serve any purpose at all? And so I'm looking down this list of codes and boards that Ms. Sullivan put together, Appendix A, and most of them, I might have missed one, but all of them except physicians say that they must be of moral character, and physicians extended as determined by the board, right? And so in my mind, I'm like, well, that takes care of if a board knows that a person shouldn't be licensed and they don't have something solid to point to. They haven't been convicted of spousal abuse. They haven't been convicted of tax evasion, whatever. But they are aware that this is not the person they want in their profession. That is the last saving grace that they can point to. But then Mr. Bragg spoke up and reminded us that that's working in opposition to many goals to standardize. So for me, it falls down to, do we allow the board that flexibility in practice, in practicality, or do we line up behind the goal of uniformity? Like, as a personal preference, I would lean to the former. I would say, let's let moral character be determined by the board on a case by case basis versus codifying and defining or eliminating. Um, I think, I mean, I'm super, super willing to have my mind changed on this. I really do like the language good moral character as determined by the board. If we put that across the board, um, more than I like elimination, but somewhere in the middle makes me uncomfortable. And as for background checks, they check for stuff that's not moral character, right? Like, I don't care if my carpenter is a horrible person. I want my stuff to be straight and square. But I do care about that for my physicians. So, I mean, I think we have to look at that as well. Anyway, my two bits, I don't know if it's terribly clarifying, but that's where I'm at mentally right now.
Thank you, Ms. Hensley. Is there any other subcommittee member comment? So a few of the things that I believe that I've kind of gleaned from this discussion before we go back to Mr. Avery is that we can't eliminate it across the board. We certainly know of one case with the real estate appraisers where it is a federal requirement that we would have it in there. So that would lead me to believe that we do have to provide a definition of some sort, whether it's through statute or through rule. Other options would be remove that requirement for everything other than those ones that we have to have in because of federal rules. Or simply, as Ms. Hensley said, leave it to each board to design the definition on their own or to figure out how they consider it on their own. So, Mr. Avery.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I kind of wanted to respond to Ms. Hensley's comments. I totally see kind of the, like you said, there is a robust conversation to be had, and I'd love to, sit down for a beer and and talk about the philosophy behind it. But I think that the important thing is that we should recognize this is very much 21st century. I think someone else mentioned this earlier too. We have Google, we've got Google reviews, we've got Yelp, we've got word of mouth. We're drowning in information already. And I think that that's not necessarily going to go away anytime soon. So while there might be a purpose for this, I think we can point to any regulation and say, hey, there is a general purpose for that. But at the end of the day, I think we have to balance that equation and say, is it really worth it? Do we want to have that subjectiveness about it? Obviously, I want to have a dentist or a doctor or a contractor that is of good moral character. But, as someone who grew up in a construction family my entire life, there are plenty of people that are licensed that, quite frankly, do some shady stuff. And I don't know if that's the right role of the government per se to sort some of those ills of society out.
And they
as
do
much
a
as
good job, Tanner.
I'd like to, in the perfect world, say that we have, those things don't just happen. But I think that we should be careful about going down that path. And, this would be a good case to probably just get rid of it entirely then.
Thank you, Mr. Avery. Ms. Narrison?
Regarding a definition, I think this might be a blanket statement that's not accurate, but I'm not sure if there is a board that has a problem with the good moral character, but by creating a definition that might create problems. So I lean to either just leave it as it is or get rid of it. But by trying to get all the boards to come together and agree on a definition might be a big task.
Yeah, thank you, Ms. Narrison. I would just make the comment that it personally as a lawmaker, it worries me when we have different entities defining something differently. I get it, what you're saying and Ms. Hensley saying that, different boards have different type of licensures and maybe they should have different considerations. But it worries me if we don't have some sort of say in what is considered and what isn't considered good moral character. So, ultimately, we need to put this one to bed at some point. Ms. Sullivan, and subcommittee members, I guess we could have somebody make a motion as to what we want to do moving forward with this. Option B would be to whittle down these policy considerations to maybe the top two or three, or come up with three options and set the date in June where we have to make a final decision. Miss Sullivan, are you happy with that if we simply whittle down the options, or are we at a time frame where we need to make a decision?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. No, I think I'm pretty sure this committee meets again before the June 8th meeting. I think it's right before the Friday before. And so what I can do is I can come up with some potential recommendations based on this conversation, and then present that at the next meeting. And then you, as a group, you guys can decide which one or ones you want to bring forward to the full task force.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Sullivan. So what I've heard the options would be, at least in my view, is one, remove that requirement anywhere that we can where there's not a federal requirement. Option B would be remove the ones that we feel aren't value added, but provide a definition for the ones that remain. And then maybe option C is, as Ms. Hensley and Ms. Avery had discussed, is either doing nothing or in our definition, just make sure that boards have the authority to do it kind of the way they want to do it. Is there any other options? I'd like to whittle this down as short as we can. Any other thoughts from subcommittee members? Dr. Harrington?
Yes, thank you, Chair Buttrey. Just an observation. Um, I, our task is to look for obstacles to simplify licensing. And as I pointed out earlier, I have never seen this invoked in my experience, and I don't view it as a huge obstacle to licensure compared to other things that we could be focusing our efforts on. So I guess my concern is that we're spending a lot of time on something that hasn't proven itself to be a huge issue in practice. So just an observation. Okay.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Harrington. And I think that's why we have one of those options be just to do nothing, and let the boards figure it out. So, Ms. McCauley.
Hi, thank you. I would add that we don't know what applications we haven't received. So suggesting that we don't know the barrier, we might not know that someone hasn't pursued a license because they think that they can't get that.
Yeah, thank you, Ms. McCauley. And we discussed that last meeting where, are there people that are not seeking licensure because they don't believe that they can meet a board's definition of good moral character? So thank you. So I'm not seeing any other hands raised. Ms. Sullivan, let's whittle it down as tight as we can. Subcommittee members, we need to make a decision in our next meeting, so please come prepared to decide which way or ways we're going to go forward. And with that, Ms. Sullivan, we can go on to the next issue. I had it on my list as the national certifying entities, but what do you have on your list?
Yes, Mr. Chair, that is the next one. And I will say there was one follow-up request regarding minimum age requirements and some like independent contractor status and all of that. We are working on getting that information together. We'll have it for the next meeting, but that was a specific request from Representative Seconder. And so I did want to wait for him to have that conversation.
That's
So
great.
didn't forget about it. The national certifying entities, Lisa, would you mind putting that one on the screen? Let's see if I can find it so I can see what I'm talking about. So this one was a request. We talked a lot about all the different national certifying entities last meeting. And I believe Representative Buttrey, this was your request. And so if I mess this up, please correct me. But our licensing board is duplicating efforts for disciplines that require certification by national entities. So what I did was, so there was a request to find all of the instances where some sort of non-Montana entity was listed in statute. There's a lot of them. And so I even provided you a table of contents. But you can see on this document that there's several boards that list the national certifying entity specifically in their requirements. And then there's, I think, just one program that does it, the genetic counselors. So you can just kind of go through to make it easier to read. I put the actual reference in blue, bold, italics, and so hopefully that pops out for you. So we could just do like the very first one, obviously, for acupuncture. So you can see they have a few requirements. They have a minimum age requirement. They have a good moral character requirement. But then they also have you have to be a graduate of a school of acupuncture that's approved by this National Accreditation Commission for Schools and Colleges of Acupuncture and Oriental Medicine. That's a mouthful. And then an exam that is administered and approved by a national commission. So all things aside, if the minimum age doesn't count and good moral character doesn't count for acupuncture, then this would be an example of an occupation where the two remaining requirements are national certifying entity type requirements. And then I'm not going to go through all of this because I want you guys just to have a conversation on it. I will say that we have had a couple instances where the name of the certifying entity changes. And so, obviously we can only make those changes every 2 years. The athletic trainers was one that needed to be updated and last year. And so we did do it then. And actually the one that I was just talking about, the acupuncturists, there is a different, they've renamed themselves. And so when you have these national accredit or certifying entities listed in code, then sometimes it will say or its successors, which is very helpful because then if the name changes in between and nobody catches it, then at least it could be or its successors. But where it doesn't say or its successors, then if the organization changes, then that obviously requires legislation. One thing that I think it's the Board of Behavioral Health did. Is they defined an approved curriculum and or something like that. They're not on this list, but because they don't actually have any of the certifying entities listed in code because they have provided kind of a definition that standardizes it and says this is what an approved curriculum means. So yeah, I didn't come up with any policy considerations for this topic, but this was, at least now you have the information of all of the different MCAs that have these organizations listed in them, Mr. Chair.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Sullivan. And if I remember some of the options that we had discussed last time, first there's the case where for an occupation, all of the licensure activity is covered by the National Certifying Agency.
Mhm.
And in those cases where there's nothing Montana specific, do we remove Montana licensure requirement? Or what do we do? And in cases where the National Certifying Entity does some of the work, but there are some Montana unique requirements, is there a chance to either simplify or streamline the licensing process? So with that, open it up to the subcommittee members for any comments dealing with national certifying entities and state licensure. Anyone have any thoughts or comments? Okay, so Ms. Sullivan, Do you agree with those two sort of options that I had stated? One being that if the state does nothing in addition to the National Certifying Agency, we need to look at removal of state licensure requirements or drastic simplification. And in the case where the state does have additional requirements, we need to look and see, are those additional requirements value added? If they are, then how do we streamline the process? Does that sound correct?
Um, yeah. I guess just Mr. Chair, for just a little clarification, are you wanting me to put together a potential recommendation for that or
Well, I mean, the third option is do nothing, but
Mhm.
I think we as a subcommittee need to figure out, is this going to be one of the areas that we're going to focus on for removal of barriers? So we don't seem to have anyone with their hands raised. I think if we're going to make those final decisions in our next meeting, that, I think we need to provide options for the subcommittee, and those would probably be those two plus one, which is just do nothing.
Okay.
Okay?
Yep, I
Okay,
can do a little
so
more research on that.
thank you. The next item I had was provisional licensure. We do have some statute that had been addressed, I think, in the 25 session. Ms. Sullivan, was there any other information you needed to provide on provisional licensure?
Um, Mr. Chair, thank you. No, I'm not sure if the committee wants to talk about like the specifics. You're more than welcome to. I think this came up in the background check and time to licensure type discussion where would it be possible to grant a license pending the outcome of a background check? And then I mentioned that that is actually one of the criteria in a provisional license. Part of that statute is temporary licensure. And again, my brain hurts, but I can't remember which committee we were talking about temporary licensure. And there's 21 calendar days per year that an out-of-state practitioner basically is allowed to work in Montana without having to get a full license in Montana. There are specific scenarios. I think there's four, and I'm going to rely on Kevin to help me with this conversation. There's, I think, four different ones if they're coming in to provide education or continuity of care. Emergency situations might be one of them. I can't remember them all. But an option for this committee is to maybe talk about, is that too restrictive? Could there be an opportunity to maybe update that policy for temporary licensure? But I think as far as provisional licensure goes, I don't recall if anybody had any ideas for revising that process.
Okay, we'll open it up to the subcommittee. Mr. Bragg, please raise your hand if you have something to add to the discussion. Is there any other discussion on provisional or temporary licensure? Mr. Bragg?
Thank you, Chair Buttry. I was able to get the statute pulled up very quickly. So I want to point out the four specific things for the temporary licensure. That's to provide education, continuity of treatment, treatment to underserved populations, or highly specialized treatment care to patients or clients. And so those were the four specific parameters we put around that temporary licensure. During the 25 session, many of you may recall, that was a broad discussion that we had with several of the healthcare associations and other stakeholders. After the 21 days, you need to get a license. And so functionally, that's how the temporary licensure works. To the provisional licensure comment, we did do a lot of work during 2025 to put or give the boards broad capability as well as the department for those department programs to regulate how they are issuing provisional licenses. And so there is the ability for each of the boards to have a discussion about whether or not they want to issue a provisional license when someone is awaiting a background check. If that's one of their requirements, there are other specific circumstances I can't recall. I'll deflect to Quinlan for that. But specifically for the background check conversation, that's not something that we've had individually with all 24 of the licensing boards. I certainly think it's an appropriate thing for the task force to discuss whether or not they want to make a recommendation that the boards take that up, and if you want to give some direction, if that's the will of the task force. But did just want to add those two things. Thank you, Chair Buttrey.
Thank you, Mr. Bragg. So when you were talking about the temporary licensure, it seems like that's more specific to healthcare providers, or does that extend past that group of folks?
So great question, Chair Buttrey. It does extend past that group, specifically the education component of it. If somebody's coming in to provide continuing education or education as an out-of-state professor, that would expand that. And then treatment to underserved populations as well. There's a variety of different things that people can do pro bono on behalf of underserved populations. So it's not specifically limited to healthcare. That may be something that the task force wants to consider, is whether or not there needs to be expansion for healthcare or a contraction, whatever the will of the task force is, but not specifically limited to healthcare.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Bragg. Are there any other comments or thoughts from subcommittee or staff? We got to quit having these meetings on Fridays. I'm echoing Chairman Seconder on that. Okay, not seeing any other discussion. Ms. Sullivan, I guess we will just keep that on the docket for discussion. I'd ask subcommittee members to really think about these things, because as we keep stating, we've got to make some recommendations coming up in the next meeting. So please keep that on your radar. Next item that I have up for discussion is multiple licensure and regarding background checks, fingerprinting, any other ways that we can provide removal of barriers for folks that have already been deemed in good standing by the state because they already hold a license. Ms. Sullivan, do you have any discussion on that?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. So, Lisa, if you could put up do the alcohol one first. So we did provide you all with links to the MCA in the alcohol and cannabis statutes that talk about, I can't read that, that talk about the what Representative Buttrey was telling the committee last meeting. How is there any way that you can increase the size of that? I don't know. Somewhere in here it says that the results, oh, right. No, I don't know. That the results of the background check are good for 5 years. Thank you so much. Approved applicants may use a single background check instead of fingerprints to multiple license applicants within 5 years. And they have to attest that no criminal charges have been filed. I'm like, they have to attest they have been. So this is a really simple example. One thing that, and then what's the cannabis one say? I don't know. Oh yes. This one says a finger-based background check meeting the requirements um, by the Department of Justice and FBI in association with an application for initial licensure and then every 5 years thereafter. So those are two really good examples. If the committee is interested in trying to streamline this or make it a little easier for applicants, I don't know, I used to know the alcohol and marijuana laws better, but I don't know how many years they have to renew their licenses. And so, but most of the occupational licenses, I believe, is annually. And so I don't know, I guess there's a couple ideas for you. One thing that I will say is that it might be easier to do a new provision that talks about background checks and then includes this 5 year grace or 3 years or however many years you guys want to do. That would be up to you. Instead of going into every single statute that talks about background checks and adding that in. So kind of like what we have been doing in the past with trying to standardize processes across all the boards, maybe creating a standardized background check statute that says, these are the requirements, these are all the professions that require a background check, and this is the process. And then for everything listed in this section, It's good for 5 years. If you wanted to apply for a second license in occupational licensing, or even I don't know if you guys want to extend it out to other agencies, or if you just want it specific to you have this license and then in 3 years you get um, more education and you're ready for the next level license. Yeah, hopefully that all made sense.
Thank you, Ms. Sullivan. Um, I actually carried the bills that removed those requirements for that 5 year period because we felt in alcohol and gaming, and Senator Nolan was heavily involved in trying to figure out the solution too, that if the state says you're a good actor, then you're a good actor for the next license, at least for a period of time. I would highly recommend to the subcommittee that we try to come up with some standardization language that would say for, licenses, if you've got one and you're applying for another, that there's a period of time where you don't have to go through the cost, expense, and time of additional background checks. But open it up now for the subcommittee members for discussion. Dr. Harrington.
Thank you, Chair. I support your contention because under rules for healthcare, you're required to report any act or issue that surfaces that would be either unethical or illegal, or like a DUI, that sort of thing. So I think we'd be well covered by extending it to that 5 year period that you're proposing.
Thank you, Dr. Harrington. Ms. Anderson?
Hi, Chairman Buttry, again, Stacey Anderson with Primary Care Association and other clients. I just want to support an idea of boilerplate language for licenses around the 5 year mark. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Anderson. Does anyone else have any discussion on this item? Not seeing any hands raised. Does anyone object to the subcommittee giving direction to Ms. Sullivan and staff to come up with some language that we could broadly insert into statute that would provide that sort of coverage for the 5 years without additional background checks? Does anyone object to that? Okay, don't see any hands raised. Ms. Sullivan, does that give you direction? Ms. McCauley?
Sorry, I was a little slow to the gate there. Thank you. With the professional licenses, I don't know exactly. Maybe Mr. Bragg can answer this or Aaron. But I don't know who pulls the data at our Board of Nurses meeting that when they renew every 2 years, which isn't the same as every 5, where sometimes something comes up where there's been a DUI or drug charges. And so I don't know who does that work on the background that identifies there's been a problem between now and the last time they licensed. But I think that's particularly important in the medical professionals and the people, the direct hands-on care. So I would offer some caution that we don't overlook that continues to be an important piece of evaluation as people reapply for licensure.
Yes, thank you, Ms. McCauley. And that is a question is, how often are background checks done? Are they done upon initial licensure? Are they done every time upon renewal? Certainly, if we were to come up with some blanket statement that would exempt additional checks within a period of time, there would also, I would imagine, need to be some self-attestation requirement if somebody were to be convicted or arrested or however we define it, that they would have a requirement to report that to the state. Mr. Bragg.
Thank you, Chair Buttry, for your specific code citations. I direct you to Mr. O'Connor. But for interim reports to the board upon renewal, each applicant, when they go to renew their license, is asked whether or not they've had some type of negative interaction. And once that happens, that then gets kicked over to our compliance unit, which again, Mr. O'Connor probably is a bit more familiar with at this point. We've had some transition over here at the department, but they will undertake reviewing each of those self-reports and then determining whether or not there needs to be a complaint filed. And then we'll go through the normal complaint process, and Quinlan would be far more eloquent at telling you about that. But we do standardized checks upon every single renewal, and then follow up on anything that is reported. For the question about whether or not or when we are doing background checks we are doing currently on initial application. There is, I believe, statutory authority to do background checks on renewals. Having said that, it is a time-consuming and costly endeavor that really delays folks getting their renewals issued, and we don't want to get outside the 45 days from a renewal date so that a practitioner would have an expired license just because they were waiting for a background check. So that is a bit of a difficult question as to whether or not we want to, or the state wants to do background checks on renewals. If I had my druthers, which I never do, I would say no, just because of the additional burden that it puts onto the licensee. However, that's certainly a policy decision that the state can take up. And I think, again, in statute, we already have the ability to do that. We just haven't done that as it's an additional burden, and we've already got a reporting mechanism for folks who have discipline that comes up. Back to the original discussion about multiple background checks, that really comes up a lot in the behavioral health field. Because we have folks that get candidate licenses. They are background checked for those licenses, and then they also have to have a background check for their full license, so to speak. And so having some additional period, the 5 years, I think is sufficient. If anyone was to ask me, that would allow them to avoid having to do an additional background check, and it would certainly help in some other areas. But broadly speaking, it really impacts behavioral health licensure.
So thank you, Mr. Bragg. And I think what's really important there is what Mr. Bragg said is that the firm requirement for background check is upon initial licensure, and certainly upon renewal, they have the ability to do it. And I imagine they would if potentially if somebody had disclosed that there had been some big issue because they have that disclosure requirement. But these background checks are upon initial licensure. Ms. McCauley.
Thank you, Chair. I would like to just follow up on that. I am glad to hear that there's just a general reporting process when issues come up so that it's aware. But in experience from the Board of Nursing and the screening panel, the obligation to report doesn't always happen, and people get caught on that. The fact that there's the reporting process in place when issues come up, I think suffices. Generally, though, if we're looking at renewal to change it from and I can only speaking from nursing standards, our national accreditation is about every 5 years. And then our renewal process for the professional nurses is 5 years with the national accrediting bodies. And then within the nursing renewal for registered nurses and APRNs is every 2 years. And I don't think we should extend that because there are a lot of things that come up on renewal that are caught in this reporting process when issues do come up. And so I think that there's enough things that come up in 2 years. I would hate to extend that to 5 years and then miss something.
Okay, are there any additional comments?
Oh, sorry, my bad. Wrong button.
Senator Zolnikoff.
Yeah, I remember a few years ago I had a nurse, or maybe it was somebody who was licensed at least under healthcare who missed something, and they had their license basically canceled because of an issue like this where they didn't realize they had their background check. I don't think this is background check. I think it's something similar though. Point is, if there's a way to extend it so that person doesn't just lose their license, but hey, they didn't know they're supposed to do it, it's taking longer. But if every 5 years you're supposed to, having them just lose their license is pretty extreme. So maybe an extension or something along those lines, so we can get the best of all worlds.
Okay, thank you, Senator Zolnikoff. Are there any other comments? Okay, I'm not seeing any. If no one objects on the subcommittee, what I'd ask Ms. Sullivan and staff to do is to come up with some language for us that at least we can consider in the next meeting that would exempt additional background checks during that 5-year period after initial licensure. Still giving the boards, as I believe Mr. Bragg had said is currently in statute, the ability to provide background check upon renewal if they have some reason to do it. I just would like to see what that language would look like. We may not agree on it, but I'd like to see the language. Is there anyone objecting to that direction to staff? Okay. So, Ms. Sullivan, I think you've got your direction there. Was there any other issues that we needed to bring up from prior meetings, Ms. Sullivan, that you wanted to discuss?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I believe that this committee has covered all of the follow-up, aside from the minimum age one, which I, already mentioned that I would like to wait until the next meeting so we can have the full data and have Representative Seconder in that discussion.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Sullivan. And I think everybody saw the note asking if we could get that proposed language and any information prior to the next meeting. And Ms. Sullivan's been really good about doing that. So we've completed our follow-up. Are there any additional items that people want to bring up in the barriers realm to discuss today or to get on the agenda for the next meeting? Okay. I'm just looking down at the agenda, Ms. Sullivan. It says begin topics, portability, reciprocity, alternative pathways, emerging fields. You want to start that?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. So for this one, excuse me, we have the big thing to talk about in this one is the difference between like reciprocity, interstate compacts, and all of that kind of stuff. And so that is the information that I provided you for in the email, and then it's also online. There's a couple publications by the Council of State Governments, or CSG, that really they're the ones that really help drive the interstate compact language. Give me a sec. I was doing fine until I had to talk. I'm sorry. So Kevin, if you wouldn't mind, or Quinlan, can you go over kind of the difference between the different portability terms like reciprocity compacts and all of that and universal licensure?
Mr. Bragg.
Thank you, Chair Buttry. I'm getting a deflection from Mr. O'Connor, but he'll be drug in appropriately. When we are talking about terms of art inside of licensing, which I know is everybody's favorite to revisit, when we're talking about reciprocity, that's a concept that comes up frequently. And generally, when we're talking about reciprocity, what we are meaning is the distinction between one person moving from one place to another and getting the same treatment. And so there is a requirement, or there's an allowance in statute for boards, licensing boards, to enter into reciprocity agreements with other states. And what that looks like is it looks like a contract broadly. And it's where one state engages another state, and then they make an agreement. And sometimes it involves several states, like there's a National Electrical Reciprocity Agreement. NERA is the acronym for that, in case you cared. And that allows folks who are licensed in one state to automatically come to Montana and immediately get a license without an evaluation of their licensing requirements in the other state. Again, those are specific contractual agreements. And then when we're talking about, excuse me, universal licensure, we are, there's different flavors for everybody, different strokes for different folks. And then also, usually when we're talking about universal licensure, we're talking about a couple of different things. And I know Aaron included the CSG document that gives you broadly an explanation of universal licensure. And it also says that Montana has universal licensure. And when I am talking with folks and talking with the legislature and you as stakeholders, I want to be really clear that I don't think that what we have in Montana is necessarily universal licensure. We have substantial equivalency through 37.1304, which allows folks to come in And it says that we must grant a license if their license requirements at the time of application from the other state are substantially equivalent to Montana's. That is generally what we have trended towards inside of the state of Montana. There are other states that have different forms of universal licensure, and one that generally gets called out most is Arizona. Arizona has a specific law for several professions. It's not all of the professions, but for several professions that if you have a license from another state and you come to the state of Arizona, you automatically get a license in the state of Arizona without a review of whatever your prior licensing requirements were inside of the other state. That is what I would probably phrase to you as true universal licensure. When we talk about how that gets implemented, again, for Montana, we do substantial equivalency for licensing requirements. Some universal licensing has to do with scope of practice. And so some states grant licenses from other states based upon what the scope of practice was from the other state. That can get quite tedious, just to be frank with you, in trying to figure out which license is which and what the scope of practice was or what was allowed to be done in the prior home state. We certainly like what we have currently inside of statute with the substantial equivalency, and certainly appreciate the legislature's help as well as our stakeholders in driving that. Licensing compacts, which was also on, I think, believe on that CSG document, which is Council of State Governments. Licensing compacts are contracts between states. They're similar to reciprocity agreements. However, licensing compacts set up individual commissions that oversee the requirements for compacts. There's a couple of different types of compacts, and if I've done this before, somebody look at the screen and just choke me out. I don't want to bore you to death, but there's a couple of different ways you can have compacts set up. One's really a facilitated privilege. That's where somebody receives a home state license and then they apply individually for privileges in each of the other member states. So they have to go to each member state and apply for a privilege. The counseling compact, physical therapy compact, interstate medical licensure compact, speech language, and then the dietitian compact are of that variety. There's also a limited privilege to practice. If you're really nerding out, you can go on the National Governors Association website. They have a great explanation of this. Limited privilege to practice is where someone gets a home state license and then they separately obtain broad privilege to practice in all of the other states. So there's not a need to go and get those additional privileges from the other states. And then we have compacts that are multi-state compacts, like the Nurse Licensure Compact, which is where applicants get a multi-state license from the home state and then can immediately practice in another member state. So a couple of different things. Certainly compacts are things that we enjoy because they allow us to get folks licensed quicker. There's obviously a setup time period with that. Generally, when I'm talking, we're usually about 18 to 24 months from the time that we get an adoption from the legislature, assuming the compact's fully set up. Usually that requires a number of states, generally 7. And then we start doing some of the back end work of setting up those compacts for people to get their privileges, but they do have a delay to them, and it's usually better to get in on the front side. That way you can have a seat at the table as a member state and make some recommendations, because each of those compact commissions have their own rules. And so you want to have the ability to have a little bit of feedback inside of that process. And Aaron, my mouth is dry. I hope I covered what you wanted me to talk about.
Thank you, Mr. Bragg. Mr. O'Connor, if you have anything to add, please raise your hand. If not, Ms. Sullivan, do you have anything to add?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you so much, Kevin, for relieving me during my coughing attack. I can let Quinlan chime in if he wants to talk about anything other than compacts. But there was another document that, because compacts seem to, are like the route that is like the most portable right now. And so I can review that document after Quinlan has a chance to speak.
Okay, and thank you, Ms. Sullivan. So subcommittee members, Ms. Sullivan knew this. I do have to get on an airplane. So I'm going to have to leave the meeting. I did talk to my good friend, Chairman Senator Noland, and he's graciously offered to take over as chair for the rest of the meeting. We've got to finish this topic and then get to any outstanding or additional issues and then talk about staff direction and future meetings. So with that, I'm going to check off and wish you all a wonderful weekend and turn it over to Senator Chairman Noland.
Thank you, Senator Buttrey. Hope you travel safely and make all your connecting flights. Okay, thank you. So with that, Miss Sullivan, we need to finalize this particular subject matter. It doesn't look like Quinlan has raised his hand, so maybe we are good to go on that, and then we can move on to the next item. Is that correct?
Okay, yeah, that's fine. Thank you, Mr. Chair. So, Lisa, if you could pull up that interstate compacts document for me, the one that we shared with the Healthcare Committee. If you're on the Healthcare Committee, you've seen this document. But I can't remember when they had their meeting a couple weeks ago. There was a good discussion at the Healthcare Committee about interstate compacts, and this document shows it'll be the one that I put together. So like not a CSG one. Yes, this one. So this is just shows kind of all of the some benefits of licensure compacts, and then it goes through. Keep scrolling, please. It goes through, here's a list of all of the compacts that are available and which ones Montana has joined what year, and which ones have not been enacted in Montana. And then, so I can't remember how many there are, like 8, looks like. So if you keep scrolling, then each page just has a little bit more detail about the individual compacts. And so you can stop on that one right now, just for an example, athletic trainers. So you can see what the athletic trainers compact does. And then there's a compact map that shows this one's actually only been enacted in 2 states. But there are several that are considering the legislation. And then there's links to the compact language and any other fact sheets and stuff like that that the compact commissions have put forward. So the healthcare committee reviewed this and had a good discussion. They are gonna get some more information next week specific to the EMS compact and the social work compact. And then they also received some information about the APRN compact from our executive officer for the Board of Nursing, who indicated that the model language is actually being revised right now. And so it wouldn't really be advisable. They were hoping to have it approved in the fall 2026 meeting, but it's looking like it won't get approved. The revisions won't get approved until 2027. And so they're not recommending using that the current model compact language for the APRN compact, but that does leave us with a few compacts that the healthcare committee isn't really looking at. So that athletic trainers is one. The cosmetology compact is also one. There's a dentist and dental hygienist compact, and we have an expert on this call to talk about that. That is an opportunity. And then I think there's one more, and I can't remember. Just keep scrolling. Okay, the EMS one, the healthcare committee is already looking at. Oh, the podiatry compact is another one, and the Board of Medical Examiners is actually they met a couple weeks ago, and they would like to join this podiatry compact. And then keep scrolling just so I can see what else is on here. School psychologists isn't really, and it's not a real like occupational license. We obviously license psychologists, but I don't think we have, maybe we do have a specific school psychologist one, but that compact is also available. The healthcare committee is not talking about that. The social work one they are. And then I just put all of the available ones on there. Department of Labor doesn't license teachers. That is, but there is a teacher's compact. So what I would encourage this committee to do is maybe discuss the remaining compacts, and if there's a need or a want for more information on those compacts, or if you want to work up a recommendation to join one or more of the remaining compacts, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Aaron. Do we have any comments from the board regarding the Healthcare Committee and the issues that Aaron just went very eloquently, even though she had to take a moment to cough or two? Does anybody have any comments regarding what they would like to see? Anything different? And to be thinking also, if you could, what directions we want to ask the staff at the conclusion, if we want to have them work on anything specific that's on your minds. You want to raise your hand. And Aaron, I won't probably be able to see any hands raised, but if anybody comes up.
Kristen McCauley has her hand raised.
Just in the interest of, thank you, just in the interest of starting any potential conversation, I think we should globally encourage and promote our support for any and all of the compacts as they come across, knowing that getting them across the line will be another task, but just generally support from the task force.
Okay, thank you. Looks like we have one more hand raised. Is that?
Yes, Dr. Harrington. Hand is raised.
Thank you, Chair Noland. I just want to echo what Kristen was saying, is that being licensed in 6 states right now, anything you can do to simplify it through these compacts is greatly appreciated, and it would certainly make recruiting to health facilities a significantly easier task. So thank you, Chair.
Thank you. So Aaron, I think you're probably making notes of that with those last 2 comments. Looks like we have one more hand raised.
Yes. Yes, Mr. Chair, Troy Jensen's hand is raised.
Mr. Jensen.
I think this is something that individual boards could probably look at. And I think this is something that the Engineers and Land Survey Board is probably going to start looking at probably at their next meeting, is seeing if there's a possibility of doing some compact type stuff with other states and having NCEES organize that compact and how it would work. But I guess hope that this task force could support if any boards wanted to take on that task of chasing after a compact with other states and other jurisdictions.
Thank you, Mr. Jensen. So Aaron, I think with our comments, we heard the one about globally supporting all compacts. Then what Mr. Jensen just commented about letting the boards have reign of that. Maybe make some bullet points on that so we do need to make some decisions. And if you want to highlight that for us, and then just remind us these are some of the topics. So if you want to make your case and you have other input, please by all means, let's do that. Do we have any other further comments? If you want to raise your hands, if we don't have any. Aaron, I did not print the agenda. Do we have anything else that we should be covering?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. So I will put together a recommendation on interstate compacts as well for the next meeting. There was one other kind of there was one other kind of topic that I pulled into this, just the portability, reciprocity, and alternative pathway conversation, and that is emerging fields. And this was actually ranked last from the 8 general topics that the committee ranked when developing the work plan. But basically, this one was it was specific to community health workers, and that they, and is there an opportunity for licensing or certifying or registering emerging fields that can get, reimbursement opportunities outside of legislation. So just a quick background, and I might rely on Stacy Anderson to help me out on this one, but there was a community health workers. There was a bill last session to license community health workers, and they are eligible for reimbursement. And I don't know if it's an emerging field, but anyways, that bill didn't pass. And so now, the next try obviously is you got to wait 2 years. And so the question was, in those instances, is there a way for those fields to get recognized for reimbursement in between legislation? And I'll have Stacy, raise your hand if there's more that you want to add to that. But I will have Quinlan kind of respond about that the department isn't, we can't just create new licenses and registrations, and registration, certification, and license all means the same thing in Montana. So I'll ask Quinlan to kind of talk a little bit more about this, and if there's any options after Stacy clarifies what I'm trying to say.
You want Quinlan to go next or Stacy?
If Stacy could just kind of explain the topic, and then I'll ask Quinlan to give the legal analysis.
Okay, Stacy, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Aaron and Chair Nolan. This issue came up primarily to think creatively and innovatively around sort of there's a general interest in the state to not create new licensures. However, in healthcare, it's come up in a couple of our meetings that for good or bad, for payment for certain healthcare employees and staff, you have to have some sort of state recognition of certification or licensure or registration. I'm trying to think creatively, and that's why I brought it up in this group. Because we are able to get CHW reimbursement through Medicare, there's also CHW reimbursement through some private payers. Is there something we can think about innovatively that's not a traditional pathway to licensure, but allows folks to essentially file their certificate with the state of Montana? And because it's healthcare in this instance, my preference would be to make sure there's some sort of enforcement, or in the instance of, after our discussion of good moral character, bad actors. Like if there's a complaint against someone with the CHW certificate, that they would be unregistered from the state of Montana. So that's what I'm throwing out there. It passed the legislature in 2025. The governor's veto was, to say it was a surprise is an understatement. But that's sort of the land we're living in right now for that particular class of employee.
Okay, thank you, Quinlan.
Sure. So we're certainly happy to have the conversations about thinking creatively, and if there are paths that we can set up. And I think as we all look at the conversations that this committee and the task force as a whole has had over the last several months concerning our HTP, wherever we can find creative solutions, we absolutely want to. That said, have a certificate and take it away if they're bad actors is the definition of licensing. So we can't do that. We, the department, nor any licensing board can do that without statutory authorization. And I don't think that the legislature could simply authorize the department to stand up new licenses when it wanted to either. I think that would likely be an unlawful delegation of authority from the legislative branch to the executive, particularly because the functional effect of licensure, as we all know, is to restrict the practice. That's the point, right? That's how you protect public safety, is you make sure that people who meet the qualifications are the only ones with the license and who can engage in that practice. But to grant that authority to the executive branch, I suspect would be problematic. That being said, if there is a baseline level of licensing, something, and I don't know if it's CHW or if it's something, below CHW, that would be recognized. You need the following 5, 10 qualifications, whatever comes up with that would start to qualify you for the other levels of licensing, right? It'd be, you can do this and then you could grow on top of this into CNA as we talk about CNAs and whether they should be a license type instead of what they currently are with the Department of Public Health and Human Services. Or, you have this baseline and then you become a CHW, or maybe you are a CHW and you step up beyond that with additional training and qualifications. That's certainly something that this task force could recommend. I can't speak to, what the department or the governor's office would think about the policy, but it's certainly something that's within the bounds of reason to have the conversation about as the baseline. What I very much can't speak to is whether that would be sufficient for insurance or Medicaid reimbursement. The department doesn't have any regulatory authority over that. And I'm happy about that, candidly. Maybe Dr. Harrington could speak to that a bit, or maybe it would be a subject for a future day. But I can't speak to what insurance does or does not reimburse, what the level of licensure requirements are. I can say from the looking into it that we've done, there is a requirement at Medicaid that there be a license, but that is relatively broadly defined or undefined in terms of what we think it needs to be. And so maybe it doesn't take much. And so then, yes, we could recognize a base level license as a stackable credential that could grow into higher tiers of licensing over time were the person to have an interest in that. And that's great. And if that's sufficient to solve the issues that you're raising, Stacy, all to the good. But I can't speak to that, and I don't know. It strikes me that the legislature has had hesitation in the past several sessions, both about standing up licensure, but more than that, about standing up a mandatory reimbursement under Medicaid or under insurance. And they wanted to leave it to the discretionary functions of those shops to determine whether there ought to be that reimbursement. I think that's all I've got, but I'm happy to answer questions if I can be helpful.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate that explanation. Gave me some more insight. And yes, the legislature really doesn't like to give up any, I won't say power, but our rights and responsibilities to any other branch, because that's our job to do our job, and not pawn it off or put it off or let somebody else take it. So I appreciate that input as well. So any questions for Quinlan, on standing up licensures or anything that Stacy brought up or Aaron clarified on the subject matters on reciprocity, emergency fields, community health issues, and reimbursements? Anybody have any comments or suggestions? If you do, please raise your hand. I think I see Miss McCauley.
Thank you, Senator Noland. I guess I just have a question. Would there be any hardship with considering the CHW as a license type, but also not obligating it for a position for a time being in the way of evaluating for how that would look for reimbursement or as a way to reimburse people who are working in that role, even as just a licensee type where they could justify a higher pay from their employer? I mean, is there any disadvantage to allowing it but not obligating it in the short term?
I don't know if that's a question for Quinlan, probably, or who. We'll put the burden on you, Quinlan.
I'm happy to take a shot at it. Typically, but not 100% of the time, licensure is mandatory. There can certainly be, that is, you can't engage in the specified practice unless you have the license, unless you meet a specified exemption. So certainly there are licenses that have overlapping practice areas. And so you can say, a lot of what a physical therapist do, a physician can also do. And so they're carved out. So you don't need to also pick up a PT license. But in the normal course, with a couple of exceptions, if the practice area is specified, then you're required to have it. There can certainly be time periods to come into compliance. I think the most complex I've seen of those has been the doula licensure that was stood up in the 2025 session, which had a delayed effective date and then a delayed mandate date, so that it was, I believe, January 1, the license type was live, but it's not mandated until January of 27 or maybe even 28. And then there was also a sunset put on it for later in, I think it's 28. So there are different time periods where it's stood up and available versus stood up and mandatory versus consideration for sunset if the legislature doesn't choose to reauthorize or repeal the sunset. Um, and so there are certainly paths to that if that is something that's helpful. I believe that there are a couple of non-mandatory license types. I want to say licensed vet techs, and you can be a vet tech that doesn't have a license also. I'd have to double check on those. There are not a lot of them. For the most part, if there's a license, the purpose of the license is to protect. I'm getting told in the chat on the side here that yes, I'm right about vet tech. So I got one today. But typically the purpose of licensure is to say this is an area that in order to ensure public safety and health, you can't practice outside of having the license. There, because of the specific supervisory requirements of some licenses like vet tech, where it's operating very closely under supervision with a veterinarian, you could make an exception in that space. Depending on the work that's being done, that either does or does not make sense for CHW or for other license types, and we could certainly work on some analysis of that, but it'll depend on actual business use cases. So that might be a place where this task force or this subcommittee has specifics that they could offer that would be helpful in trying to figure out those answers.
Well, just as a kind of a to final follow up or kind of clean up that thought process, um, uh, with the incredible nursing shortage that isn't going to be answered in the near future. The apprenticeship is a nice thing, but it's not going to solve the problem. The nursing shortage is only going to expand over subsequent years. And we have med aids, and that's kind of another licensed sort of type that I think could fall in with this vet tech or the CHW certificate or licensure, however this is looked. I think they all kind of fall in that same area. And so I see an absolute need, a vacancy where there are a lot of people administrating medicines that we can't justify obligating a license anytime in the near term because there just isn't a way to fill the need. But when you have people handling medications and accountable to other individuals in such a vulnerable position, that's something that will need to be evaluated. And as we're looking at CHW certificates, license type, and this idea that you could maybe allow it but not obligate it for a time period, I think that maybe enters this conversation at some point.
And I think that's exactly the stackable credential conversation that we're having, and particularly brought up by our HTP. You look at CHW and you look at CNA and you look at med aids, and so once you can move up into one of those tiers, and can you move beyond that into LPNs, and can you move, not that there's not further training required, but that you get in the door, you start doing work that's related to this. You can continue to learn while you're on the job. You can potentially apprentice into the next tier. You can potentially apprentice into the next tier beyond that, and continue to look at the places where, what is the baseline? What's the core that in order to have any of these you would need? And then how do we expand beyond that? What are the different paths that you could take to stack on top of that baseline credential? And where do those go? What is the baseline is the first part of that. And does that need to be a license or not? And then once you have that, how do you stack the credential to get to the next rung and train up and continue to progress? Looking at the non-traditional pathways to get into the higher level license types and be able to provide better services, I think is exactly the focus that our HTP is bringing into light. And so how can we get there, and how can we use licensure to support that pathway rather than standing as a barrier to that pathway?
Thank you.
Hopefully that gave you some good direction and some good ideas and answered your question, Ms. McCauley. So Aaron, regarding evaluations, I know that would probably be a bullet point we're going to have to look at, that was just brought up, and Quinlan answered very well. Thank you. But if that brought up any more questions, please, members, let's bring that up now. I see Brad Longcake has got a question.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I have a quick question about compacts. I wasn't sure if this was the appropriate time because I didn't want to derail this conversation, but if there's an opportunity for me to have a quick comment on that, let me know if this is the appropriate time or at the end.
Well, I think in 2027 you could bring that up. How about? No, go ahead at this time. Go ahead, Brad.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, just a quick clarifying question. I know we talked about the compacts and there were a couple different viewpoints on that, whether the committee was going to continue to discuss that or if that was going to be down to each of the independent boards. But my only comment is I know that with RHTP, there's such a huge focus on dental care and dental health. And I think compacts are a great opportunity to expand the dental workforce. It gives people an opportunity to work across state lines, whether you're coming in from a different state or you're going to a different state or you're continuing to work in Montana. And I think just improving that ability to have additional access to care and potentially bringing more people into the workforce. So is this something that we as the Barriers Committee are going to continue to work on, or did we decide to turf that back to each of the independent boards? And maybe that's a question for Aaron. Apologize.
Yeah, fine. So Aaron, if you want to be thinking of that and take a drink of water so you can continue. But my comment, on compacts, we did have a little bit of a discussion on that already. And obviously we want to have interaction. We do not want to stifle. I believe this committee doesn't want to stifle people from coming back and forth from state to state. I think that's our goal, is to help that so we get more people in without restricting. We just want them to fight, make sure the guidelines are good. They met the Montana guidelines, and if they did, they shouldn't have to have a big barrier. So, Aaron, did you have other comment on that?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. No, I did. I think I said, maybe I didn't, that I would come back for the next meeting with a recommendation or some recommendation options for this subcommittee to embrace the compacts.
Great, thank you. So, Brad, that's what we're going to be looking at it, and she'll get back with us.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I just think it's a great opportunity. I know there's several members on the dental board that are on national boards that are kind of working on compacts. So I think it's just a great opportunity to align that. So thank you.
Great. And with Aaron's very capable abilities and her young mind that she can comprehend what we're trying to tackle, she'll give us some really good input. So is there anything else on this particular matter? Hopefully we got Stacy's issues addressed. Did anybody else have any specifics on this particular topic? If you do, please raise your hand. Miss McCauley.
Hi, are we beginning talking on portability and alternative pathways yet, or are we?
Excuse me, Mr. Chair. That topic, yes, that was kind of all in one. Portability, reciprocity, alternative pathways. It was that was Kevin's description of like the different terminology, and then the discussion on the interstate compacts. That was that topic.
So as we kind of begin that topic, I just want to lay maybe a groundwork or the idea that in rural Montana, this care doesn't just happen in traditional settings. And so when we look at how providers enter the workforce, I want to make sure that we're looking about how they're actually allowed to function. One barrier that looks at portability and ability to function within the roles is that sometimes there are rules that tie roles to specific degrees rather than demonstrated competency or training. For an example, right now, EMS and facility oversight roles largely require physician designation, which makes perfect sense if there's a qualified physician on staff. There's been situations where a radiologist is the only physician in some of these rural rural hospitals. And so then you have a radiologist who hasn't had primary care or any EMS history being in a role when they don't have that competency at all. And so would we look at barriers related to the ability to practice and perform function? I would like to have us look at removing specific degree titles to certain to remove degree titles as a requirement for roles and look specifically at competency and training and current clinical experience as one of the things that we talk about when we delve into that further.
Thank you. And we're going to, some of us who don't live in your world and the world that you just described are relying so much. And I appreciate the governor's setting this whole task force up so that we can address these things with a whole bunch of eyes looking at it, not just the legislator who, we're practically perfect. I understand, but we make mistakes. So we greatly appreciate everybody's involvement and input. And that's what this whole thing is about, is giving input. One of the other things that I had a concern with is, telemedicine, which I like. I think it's a great opportunity. I guess I won't share all my knowledge because there's not enough hours in a day because I'm so smart. But thank you for smiling. We have had some abuse of that as well. And I don't think it's intentional. When I'm grateful that people are stepping into that realm so we can help folks that aren't able to travel. I mean, it's a wonderful, wonderful technology, but there's also some concern that I had with that. But I'm grateful that we're working to that. Anybody else have any comments? Aaron, did you get some good notes on what Miss McCauley just brought up? If you did, great. You don't need to talk about it. You can just, unless you want to address it right now.
Oh, that's fine. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I always go back and watch the meeting over, and so I can take better notes than I have taken so far today. But yeah, we didn't really touch on the alternative pathways portion of that topic, just based on what I had an opportunity to put together in between meetings. And so we can certainly explore that again at the next meeting. And Kristen, if you wouldn't mind maybe sending me some specific examples and if they're in statute or rule, that would be very helpful as I pull this together. The other thing that I would say with that topic and also the telehealth one is that the healthcare committee is also looking at these things. And so, we kind of talked at the April 13th meeting about where there was like cross topics or however it was described, and maybe which committee should focus on it. And so we're not really duplicating efforts due to the limited time that we have. So that's just something, and we can, Kristen, I know you're on the healthcare subcommittee. We can talk about that next week as well. If this committee thinks that the healthcare committee should tackle those topics instead of this one, as long as it gets addressed, I don't think it really matters. So
well,
that's all
since
I have to say about that.
You're the one helping us organize, and again, if we haven't thanked you enough, we want to continue thanking you.
You've thanked me too many times.
But well, your statue's being built. But
oh, great.
You're obviously in communicating, since you have a pulse on everything we're doing as your wonderful your job. Yeah, just let us know because I'm on all those boards too, or all these committees too. So if we see one more needed, hey, we focus on this, just bring it to our attention, and then we'll just address it. Aaron, did we cover all the subject matter?
Yes, Mr. Chair, we did. And I don't know if you have the agenda up.
Nope.
You do not? Okay, so then I can just, with your permission, I can just go through the rest of it. So the next meeting for this committee is Friday, June 5th at 9 a.m. So it is the Friday right before the full task force meeting. And so I have my punch list of things to bring to that. And I don't know what else we're discussing, but we'll figure out an agenda. And then future meetings for this task force are July 10th and August 14th. So 3 meetings left. As far as for the full task force meeting on June 8th, I will be sending out a communication after this meeting with just a little bit of information. So just to remind everybody, it is in Billings on June 8th, which is a Monday. The main meeting is going to be held at City College, which is out on the west end of town. And then we're also arranging a tour of the Rocky Vista University, which is just down the road from City College, for the theme, I guess, for this upcoming meeting is going to be healthcare focused, just because there are so many topics that touch on healthcare. And so we will be arranging some panel speakers or some speakers and presentations regarding healthcare. And so, obviously that's why we wanted to include Rocky Vista in that. So to that end, I will be sending out links for room blocks. We have negotiated the government rate, even though not all of you are government employees, for 2 different hotels. One is on the West End-ish. It's on off of King and 24th, and then the other one's downtown in case you'd rather stay downtown. But are looking at a full day, so 8:30 to about 4:30 on Monday. And so keep that in mind as you make your arrangements. I would recommend once you get those room links, or whatever they're called, the hotel links, to book your rooms as soon as possible, because there's like a 10-day window on the room block, and so we need to have things booked by probably the end of next week. But I'll have all that information in an email for you coming out in just a little bit. And then with that, the last item on the agenda is public comment. And so I will read this. And if you are interested in providing public comment, please raise your hand now. But the subcommittee now offers the public in attendance an opportunity to comment on any public matter under the jurisdiction of the subcommittee that is not on the current agenda. The subcommittee cannot act, but will listen to comments and may ask staff to place the issue on a future agenda. The chair may limit the comment period to proceed with the subcommittee meeting. And just for awareness, we are at 10:57. But we have one person who has raised their hand, and so we'll call on Adam Schaefer.
Thank you, Chair, members of the subcommittee. Appreciate all your work on this. I'll be brief. Issue we raised a couple of meetings ago. Just want to keep on your radar that current regulations prevent applicants for a security guard license from beginning the licensing process until they're officially hired, adding unnecessary time to the onboarding sequence. This is a challenge that we face in our hospitals in hiring security guards. We'd encourage the task force to look at potential education or credentialing programs for pre-employment licensing for Montanans seeking a career in security. And then also just on the provisional licensing topic, would encourage, if the department feels that they need any clarification or changes in statute or rules to be able to provide provisional licenses for security guards, we would encourage that. Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have any other comment?
If anybody else would like to provide public comment, please raise your hand now. That's the last one.
Okay, so making sure we did accomplish, the staff directions. You feel, Aaron, you've got enough directions. And I wanted to also comment, this committee and all these committees that we have the privilege of sitting on is to help the citizens of Montana and us as in the fields that we have some expertise in, to help facilitate smooth transitionings, easier way to access so that we can get everybody covered in all the fields that we need to, and getting licenses done properly. So if you have questions and you have thoughts, email them all to Aaron and don't bother me. No, I'm just kidding. But we have certain chairs that run these committees, and Aaron can direct you to them so we can get these put in the right place so we can address them. Everybody's important. Everybody matters. We all have great ideas. And I know we don't all agree, as I heard some of the comments today. That's fine. That's why we're all a committee, and we can talk about it and resolve issues. So, Aaron, do we have anything else need to go forward?
No, sir. We're good.
All right. With that, I think we're all done. Appreciate everybody's in attendance. We're going to get out of here almost in 2 hours. And Aaron, take some good cold and flu remedies, and maybe that will help. We do appreciate you and everybody else. With that, this meeting is adjourned.
Thank you all.